Today's film is George A. Romero's 1978 classic, Dawn of the Dead, the central piece of a trilogy which many would argue is one of the greatest trilogies in American and world horror. Interestingly enough, the film followed Night of the Living Dead but didn't have part of the title of the Living Dead because George Romero had lost the rights to this in a battle with John Russo, who had helped write the original film that Dawn of the Dead is a sequel to. John Russo went on to produce the wildly successful Return of the Living Dead with the help of Alien writer Dan O'Bannon. There are various different cuts of the film. The definitive version to Romero himself is the 126 minutes version. There are others available. One of the most notable is the supposed director's cut, or the Cannes cut of the film, a version that George Romero had created as a sort of work print that was rushed into the Cannes Film Festival. And also there is a cut by Dario Argento, which may be a name familiar to some of you horror fans out there. Now, Dario Argento's role in Dawn of the Dead is often shoved aside, but he was greatly involved. He was a very famous Italian horror film director of giallos, which are a kind of cross between police procedurals and horror films, such as Deep Red, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and an all-time classic horror called Suspiria. Now, what's interesting about Argento here is it was his idea to help finance a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, and he actually took George Romero to Italy to work on the script. Now, in the finished film, in the Romero cut of the film, his influence can't be seen really that often, the biggest influence of which is perhaps music provided by the rock band Goblin, who'd provided the score for Deep Red and Suspiria, and were a fantastic prog rock band from Italy in the 1970s and 80s. And the Romero cut is the version that we're going to be looking at in particular. Now, somebody once asked me, is Dawn of the Dead the greatest zombie film of all time? In my opinion, no, it's not. But it could be one of the most interesting social commentary films to feature zombies in. Take, for example, the rest of the work of George Romero, okay, in relation to Dawn of the Dead. Many of his films tackle social issues like attitudes to race and ethnicity, social class, and that's quite apparent in Dawn of the Dead. The shopping mall is very much a metaphor for consumerism in the late 70s in America. All the zombies go there, and at one point there's a conversation between David Emge and Ken Foray, who are the two main actors, who confess that they think that the zombies are there because it's a place that they recognise, a place that was important in their lives. As for the acting, there are no Oscar winners here. However, there are some really interesting performances. Galen Ross is a standout as the strong female lead, a marked change from the character of Barbara in the first movie, who's in a catatonic state from shock throughout most of the film. But Galen Ross is a kind of pre-Sigourney Weaver, strong woman kind of role, which is really good to see, which was a lot more common because the second wave of feminism was really kicking in the kind of late 60s, early 70s, and that's apparent in a lot of films of that particular time. Younger viewers might recognise Ken Foray, who is really interested in the film. You might recognise him from Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, but predominantly mainly be noticed from a TV show in which he played the father, which was called Kenan and Kel, which was really popular on Nickelodeon in the 1990s. The majority of the film score is provided by the rock band Goblin. That's the Argento influence there. There are two soundtracks available. Their original, and also a disc of instrumental music as well, which is what we call library music, because George Romero got this additional music from film libraries. Those of you that are from Britain might know an area called Salford, just outside Manchester, where people have accents not too dissimilar to mine, and one of the music cues was actually provided by somebody from there, who was also a filmmaker who was known as the Orson Welles of Salford. He did a very famous video nasty in the 1980s called GBH, filmed around Manchester. Noticeable things to look out for in the film, well, there's many highlights, but the stunt work, which is quite incredible, by Tom Savini and Tasso Stavrakis. Tom Savini also provided the majority of the makeup in the film, and he would go on to be a greatly respected figure in horror. He was to work on the original Night of the Living Dead, but he was actually fighting in the Vietnam War at the time, so a lot of his work is based on some of the injuries that he saw of the dead bodies and things in Vietnam. Also interesting, there is a little cameo from George Romero as well, dressed as a Christmas zombie during the pie fight sequence. The vast majority of that is actually cut out of the main Romero cut, but I believe there are some still images of that somewhere on the internet that are worth checking out. If you've not seen the film for a while and perhaps have one of the original VHS copies, you might have a slightly different version than the commercially released Romero cut. The reason for this was that 4 or 5 seconds of the film were removed in the mid-90s after the Dunblane massacre in Ireland, next to the United Kingdom. There was somebody that went into a school and shot a group of young people, and there is a similar scene where a zombie child is actually shot, so that was actually removed from various prints of the film. Quite a few horror fans have asked me, how does this fit into the Romero canon in terms of the zombie trilogy? And of course, Romero went on to expand this trilogy much later with Land of the Dead, with money from Universal Studios, and quite funny performances, Dennis Hopper channeling Donald Rumsfeld. Of course, there is Diary of the Dead and various other entries into the series as well. In my opinion, Dawn of the Dead has probably some of the most interesting social commentary. Some critics have argued that it perhaps doesn't have the strong level of effects as the much later film Day of the Dead, where Tom Savini does perhaps some of his best work. Some people have kind of criticised the blue zombies. Well, actually, that was grey makeup. It was just the way that the film was processed, which is known as colour timing. And the film's also come under criticism at times for the way it has sort of cartoonish depiction of violence. Tom Savini said he actually prefers Day of the Dead at times because of this. And I think personally that even though Savini is a true horror film legend, he misses the point. It is the real cartoonish, fun nature of Dawn of the Dead which makes a lot of the social issues it talks about so interesting and accessible. There are quite a lot of interesting mistakes in the films. In my view, that kind of adds to the charm. So there's various kind of zombie deaths where there are squibs that you can see. Squibs are like packs of blood and things. Sometimes they don't go off. Tom Savini falls off a motorbike at one point. You can actually see pillows stuffed down his back. There's a bit where Tom Savini is hit by a truck playing a zombie, and you can actually see him jumping off a trampoline at one point. At one point, Galen Ross actually refers to one character by the actor's real name, calls him David in the opening scene at the TV station. In terms of the Romero canon, I think this is one of his strongest works, maybe perhaps not the technically best film in terms of filmmaking. So if you look at a film like Day of the Dead, it's much superior in terms of the composition of images, some of the music that's used, and perhaps the editing is much better. However, I think this is Romero is most hearty. Films in a kind of post-French New Wave mode, to me, break down often into two categories. Those that are very stylized in terms of the way that they look, the editing and composition, what we might call film grammar. They're very much influenced by the work of Jean-Luc Godard, and there are films that are perhaps more influenced by the work of Francois Truffaut, who was perhaps less stylistically, you know, kooky and crazy, and have the crazy stylistic flourishes, but some of his work has some like really interesting social commentary to it, and they focused on ordinary everyday issues and things like class, consumerism. I can see them quite ripe in Dawn of the Dead, and it's quite worthy of study for anybody doing media studies or film. The real standout sequence for me, it's probably the most famous one, is where the characters are stood on a balcony looking at the shopping mall, and Ken Foray, his character, explains that his father was a priest in Trinidad who believed when there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth. And I think that's a kind of brilliant scene. It adds a lot of heart to it.